Welcome to the Promise Podcast, where we discuss how brands can deliver on their promise with a great customer experience and business impact. I'm your host, Harald Lamberts, and in each episode, I talk to business executives, thought leaders, and founders about how to achieve effective collaboration across departments, such as brand, marketing, product development, customer experience, and support, all with one goal in mind: a seamless customer journey with great business results. In today's episode, I'm happy to welcome Bruce Temkin, visionary CX leader and human experience expert with nearly 40,000 followers on LinkedIn. Very impressive. Welcome, Bruce.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you on the show. I mean, I read so much about you in the last years, so it's great to have you on the show. Bruce, before we dive in and do your proper introduction, what is a brand that you actually personally truly appreciate that is really delivering on its promise to you in terms of service offering and customer experience?
We're jumping into my preference. Well, a lot of them come to mind, but I'll go with Delta. Remember, you asked me about my experience, right?
Yes.
I travel a lot, and I'm a Delta Diamond level customer. Yep. And what I really like about what they do is they figured out what are the benefits that I like as a traveler, right? Like, there's a bunch of things they could do for me, but the most important thing for me is I get upgraded right away, right? And I really appreciate that. And I think what Delta does is understands. Now, you don't get that treatment if you don't travel as much as I do. So other listeners might be going, what's going on? But for me, as an active traveler, I really appreciate that they understand what I want and deliver me value in accordance with my relationship with them. That's
it, right? So that's for any company, for any target group to figure out, of course, how do you maximize the value perception that you have with that. So yeah, great example, I think. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, we might come back to that later during the episode, but let me properly introduce you first. So Bruce Temkin has over 30 years of professional experience in CX-related roles, initially at Forrester, if I researched correctly. After that, he founded his own customer experience research and consulting firm, Temkin Group. And at the same time, or shortly after, founded the CXPA Association for CX Professionals, still active today. In 2018, Temkin Group was acquired by Qualtrics, where Bruce founded the XM Institute, aiming to build a community around experience management. Still, actually, our team is using it, actually. So well done. And a year ago, Bruce founded Humanity at Scale, a movement to encourage the creation of mindsets and systems that propel the positive evolution of human engagement. Wow, that's an impressive statement, Bruce, and welcome to the Promise Podcast.
Thank you. I'm overwhelmed by that description. There's a lot of work for us to do going forward.
For sure. So we'll peel it off one by one. So I think that's really impressive. I really admire for all those achievements that you've made, and I'm very anxious to learn more about what drove you to some of those steps, and also, of course, some very practical learnings or best practices that you learned along the way that our audience can really leverage. That would be fantastic. Anything you want to add to this that I just described? Is there something missing that defines you or that drives you?
Well, it's interesting. We're gonna go over my background a little bit, and I would say that the thing that always gets me is that I think we're going to try and put structure and rationale and reason to how I got to where I am today, when in fact I think it was a series of unrelated events and things that happened along the way. Right? It sounds so neat and organized when you look back on it. But I can tell you that, I started my career designing submarine missile systems. And I wasn't starting with the idea that someday I'm going to be focusing on humanity at scale. Right. But things happen along the way. And I'd say that for the latter part of my career, I've been focused primarily on helping organizations understand and better treat people. Right. And the roles that I've had and the things that I've done have all been wrapped around.
That's a good way to put it. I think that sounds, if we're looking at the whole history, it feels like that's the red thread in what you've done. Indeed. And isn't it funny that in hindsight, things look really like a master plan, but actually, spontaneous events can really have quite an impact on your journey. And I never thought I'd be an agency or consultancy founder 20 years ago, and here I am. So it's funny how that works, isn't it? So
yeah, I was going to say, I think that the only people that have like a vision of a destiny of where they go are pretty much only doctors, lawyers, and accountants. Everyone else weaves their way to where they end up.
It's also a bit boring to have everything planned. I mean, isn't it much more interesting to adapt to new insights? So very useful, I think. Wonderful.
I think so.
All right. Let's start with your time at Forrester. Is it fair to say that this phase then, after what you just mentioned, is this phase shaped you as a research or customer experience professional, or what would you say?
I would say it fine-tune some elements of that, because if I was really to go back to, I could go all the way back to the beginning of my career, but I wouldn't do that. But after I got my MBA, I worked as an internal consultant at GE, where I focused on customer service and marketing programs. And I really focused a lot on things that weren't called customer experience back then, but really are foundations of customer experience. So I did global satisfaction studies for the plastics business to understand globally the connection between satisfaction and repeat customers and the impact that had on all of GE's plastics businesses, along with some of the other businesses. I led what amount to be Six Sigma projects. I don't know, the audience probably knows what Six Sigma is. I actually led... I led the first ever Six Sigma projects at GE, where we were focused on customer-facing processes and how we would eliminate waste and downtime in some of the. So a lot of that stuff was foundational for how I think about customer-facing application, how I think about how organizations work. But it really was at Forrester where I fine-tuned my ability to communicate and think about how to deliver information at scale on some of those topics. So when I started at Forrester, I led the B2B practice. So everything that had to do with supply chains and manufacturing and even CRM. I sort of managed, and then it evolved to what eventually was defined and described as customer experience. But there were threads of that all along the way.
I mean, all of these things still sound so super relevant if you mention it. I mean, also the process optimization in Six Sigma. I mean, sometimes we need to go back to that more, because actually sometimes we're losing sight of it, that a lot of the customer experience advancements that you want to make actually require process optimizations in the backstage, especially in like siloed organizations. So sounds like still super relevant for today's work, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I think about my background, one of the reasons why I think I've been able to drive a following around customer experience is that my background is not from the traditional, even today, I would say traditional customer experience come from data and insights. Some had historically come from design. I came from business management. I knew how large organizations operate. I care about how they operate. I care about scale. And that is the mindset that I took with me when I even started talking about customer experience. And I always thought about it not from the view of necessarily a customer experience professional, but from the view of a business leader and what they might want to get out of the tools and capabilities 100%. That customer experience provides.
Yeah, I know. Ultimately, that's what many CX or departments or initiatives need to still do better, right? Is connect to business outcomes and really make sure that the link is there to contribute. Ultimately, customers are the value, and not customer or business, but customer is business. Yeah, so I think that's still something that is, especially when larger organizations grow into siloed departments, is sometimes lost. That disciplines become so narrow or vertical that this connection between business outcomes and customer centricity is kind of like detached from each other. Anything. And maybe that's a good bridge to like moving to your next stage, when being a consultancy founder myself, I'm very curious to hear what led you to found Temkin Group and also maybe CXPA afterwards. What was it that you wanted to address? Was that related to some of what we were just discussing, or like what did you see there that you said, okay, I can achieve more here. I can be valuable here.
So in 2008, there was like the recession hit. And while the recession was difficult on almost all companies, it was difficult on Forrester where I was at. But my business, my customer experience following grew. So while the entire economy was down, my business was expanding. And so I realized that there was something there. And so I decided that rather than continue to be a piece inside of Forrester, I would create Temkin Group with my wife, which is wonderful. And my kids were an age where we felt like it was a time we could sort of start something.
Yep.
And so we created Temkin Group to be an organization focused solely on helping organizations, and it was mostly large organizations because those are the people that I work with most, how they could transform what they do to be more customer centric. Turned out to be a pretty easy, clean transition because I was doing a lot of the same things I was doing before. And
what was the need? What was the challenge or the need that you spotted in the market and that you that drove you to basically position it like that? Because that's
so it'll be the same thing that when we get to the CXPA that drove me, which is when I was at Forrester, a lot of the growth of my business was in answering the same basic questions to companies and individuals over and over again. Yeah. Absolutely basic questions. And so one of the things we did as analysts was we had inquiries, or they ended up being like the equivalent of mini consulting things. And I was, for 3.5 years, I was the most read analyst at Forrester across all the analysts. And for several of the quarters, I was the most, I had the most consulting hours. So like I saw that there was a need, but in my mind, I didn't want to continue to just deliver basic, simple answers over and over again. I felt like there needed to be a better way. So we created Temkin Group with the idea of we can go beyond that and actually empower organizations to figure this out for themselves, right? And that's what Temkin Group was all about. Like my goal was always, how can we help organizations with doing as little as possible from us as we could. If we wrote things and could write playbooks that they could do on their own and never actually have to talk to us, that was awesome. If they needed us to come in for a simple thing, awesome. Good.
Build the capability, helping them to build the capability to be self-sufficient, right? Like to really say, how can we not just outsource something, but actually help them establish a lasting capability that is also still there once you're helping someone else. Yeah, so that is really like establishing capability, customer-centric capabilities in the organization. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think self-sufficiency is always been a core goal for the last several decades of what I do. And partly because I'm a super introvert, right? I'm a off the charge introvert. So if I can figure out something in my office or with my team, right, that you can consume without talking to me or talking to us, awesome.
Interesting. Well, still, you can have 40,000 followers being an introvert. That's encouraging for many people as well. So that's well done. Joking aside, but I mean that's great. So, what were some of the main initial strides at Temkin? And were they more very focused on establishing practice, or were they also more transformational in terms of working with management to kind of really organize customer centricity? Or can you say a little bit about that? What was the nature of the work?
Yeah, so the first thing we did at Temkin Group was published a report that talked about the 4 customer experience competencies. And it's been, and I'll also tell you, when we created XM Institute, the first thing I did was create the 6 XM competencies. Right. And the reason why we do, and it's like debates over which competency model. You use competency models. So to me, it was important. That was the first time there was ever really a competency model in customer experience. And that was important to me because it creates a simple, easy to understand breakdown of what you have to do in customer experience that we used as a platform to be able to teach, explain, and guide not only customer experience professionals, but maybe more importantly, leaders of businesses, right? Because customer experience before that was sort of this sort of hazy, ill-defined thing. But once we said, okay, it's this 4 things, then it was really powerful to talk to leaders about. It's okay, you've heard about customer experience, and I'll see if I can remember them. For us, it was purposeful leadership, employee engagement, customer connectedness, and compelling brand values. So if you do those 4 things, that's customer experience. And so throughout our 8 years, that was the central model. So when we sold our business to Qualtrics, that was still the model that we used to teach and talk about customer experience 8 years later. And it was as powerful 8 years into it as it was the first day we introduced it, because it provided clarity for leaders to do what they needed to do.
Experience being such an abstract term for many, especially if you're not, you basically, if that's not your background. So, and with many executives, of course, the case. So this really helped maybe make it tangible and actionable for management to basically say we can do this. Gives us the confidence that we can actually achieve progress on this front and establish these capabilities. So that makes a lot of sense. Actually, we're still using it today, right? Okay, as you put, there's like 4 or 6 or the CXPA model, or in a week speaking to Carrie Bodine and her book Outside In, of course, also the 6 capabilities there. But I mean, there's variations in these frameworks, but they all kind of pretty much come down to the same capabilities if you really analyze it. And that's I think, different flavors of maybe where you start, but it's pretty similar, I think. And we're using it actually also in a similar way. So one thing you put there is one of those 4 competencies was having a compelling brand value or brand promise. And of course, this podcast being the Promise Podcast is very much related to that. And it's like, okay, well, because ultimately, as a company, there's some sort of strategy of how you position your brand and what you want to be known for. Like, how do you try to differentiate across the competition, especially in commodity businesses, of course. And for us experienced professionals, very important, I think, to really connect with that. Like, if this is the brand and this is the way we position the brand, how does our actual customer experience along the whole customer life cycle and journey contribute to that or connect with that? And if you want, assuming you want to have a coherent experience with that. Yeah. So I'm curious that, how do you see this? Like, is it your views and learnings on connecting, like what a strategic brand differentiation ambition would be, with how you can put that into practice as customer experience professionals on a daily basis across the different touch points? Like, do you have any learnings or anecdotes from your experience that can really help other professionals connect to that strategic anchor?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk about it, it seems so obvious, right? That the experiences you deliver should support the brand values and the differentiation that you espouse. The reality is that it doesn't happen hardly ever. And for many reasons. I'll start with one that I think is core, which is, I think most organizations have lost the ability to truly understand what their brand values are. Right. I think that's unfortunately it's lost. Organizations end up focusing on what are we going to do to drive our revenues? Where are the profits going? They lose sight of what is it that they want? What space do they want to own in the minds of their customers, right? And the minds of their prospects. And so they don't spend enough time both understanding what their customers and prospects and future customers may want. And they also don't spend the time in determining what are the promises that they want to put out into the market. So that to me is where a problem. So a lot of times I would say that when we were working with clients, it would start with a brand definition work. right? Let's not get into this whole talking about customer experience till you understand what you want your brand to mean in the eyes of those audiences. And once we have that, once you have the values that you want to deliver, and then there are a set of promises that you want to keep to be able to deliver on that, then you can take it and say, across the and I don't even like touch points. I like journeys, right? Because I think touch points are hard to figure out. Journeys, like becoming a new customer, right? So across your journeys, are those journeys living up and reinforcing the values and the promises that you want to keep? Like, right? That to me is where we need to go. And I'll go back to, I do want to talk about the interactions and versus journeys for a little bit after that. But I do think it starts with understanding who you are and what you want to be in the marketplace.
For sure. And actually, we've seen examples of sometimes that if you're a smaller company, of course, that the customer promise and the brand promise are almost the same or fairly similar. In a bigger corporate with very different propositions to very different target groups, that can of course also be a brand architecture there where you say, okay, on a generic brand level, this is what we stand for, but per target group proposition, kind of like translated that to a tangible customer promise. Maybe the delta, like consumer leisure travelers and maybe frequent business travelers, could be different. Yeah. And so that promise translate different to you as a frequent business traveler than to an occasional holiday traveler, because it might lead to different things. But the common brand promise could contribute both to the same brand promise, for example. But the more tangible you make that, then of course the easier it is also to deliver on that in the journey, as you mentioned, because then you can say, if this is our proposition promise in terms of offering and experience and what we stand for, then we can also make sure that in the key moments of that journey, that is actually being delivered against. And what we see, I'm not sure if you learn that as well, is that especially like more purpose-driven organizations are actually better at that, because that's really core to what they do. And sometimes more commercially driven organizations tend to lose out of that or move away from that, forget about connecting the two. I'm not curious to hear if you have any examples of success factors of organizations that have done that really well.
I think that's a great comparison. The purpose-driven organization, it is easier because it's ingrained in what they do oftentimes. But the example of where it doesn't work is, I'll share with you, there was like this local restaurant that we used to go to, and the service was okay, the environment was okay, but they gave you these enormous meals, right? The food was decent, decent enough. It was a fun enough place, but they gave you these big meals, and over time, as they were trying to like maintain profitability or whatever, the meals would shrink, and then all of a sudden, what we realized was, now there was nothing redeeming about this restaurant. The servings were about the size as everyone else, and all the other stuff that they had going on was mediocre. We never went back, and they ended up closing.
They killed their only USP, basically.
Exactly, because they didn't know what it was, right? Because it's easy to make incremental decisions that lower your value prop if you don't understand how the promises you're making connect to that value prop, and you're not measuring it and cherishing it, right? So it's not even a measurement. It's like if you don't understand who you are and what makes you special, then you can't maintain it. And then you become, and I've seen this in lots of companies. What happens is, if you don't understand that, then you look around and you become like everyone else, right? Mm-hmm. There is enormous pressure for every organization to look like everyone else around them. That's why when you see leaders who aren't strong, what they do is they lead their organization to average mediocrity, right? And
that's interesting, you have to fight actually, that. What you're saying is, of course, we all need to understand what is broken in our experience, but we also really need to understand what makes us successful in the experience, because you also don't want to remove those the drivers for loyalty, basically. Yeah? So I think commonly, very much, we're focused often as organizations on optimizing the CX and finding the pain points and frictions and solving those. But equally, I think also important to understand what is actually creating the loyalty currently. And so we also don't remove that from what we have.
I would even see it's equally important. I'd say it's even more important, right? I think we focused way too much time on fixing things that are broken. Right. And if you do that without an understanding of what it is you want to actually deliver and how you want someone to feel or think about you, then you're probably spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of money fixing things that don't really matter, or fixing things that matter to the people you shouldn't really care about that it matters, right? So yeah, I think that's a problem with CX is we've focused way too much of our energy on running after and fixing problems.
Yeah, so know what is broken, but also really don't forget what creates the loyalty of your customers or the conversion that you're currently offering. It's a great a bridge actually to, I just saw you released a podcast episode with Fred Reichelt on NPS and loyalty. And one of the things, I didn't watch the whole podcast yet, but I saw one clip you posted. And he said, so many people use NPS the wrong way. And actually, he even said you don't even need surveys to do NPS. You actually just need to understand what makes them appreciate or not your offering. And this actually, I think, very much related to what we just discussed for the restaurant example. I didn't listen to the whole episode yet, but is there anything, learnings or insights you could share maybe with the audience from that podcast with Fred? Because I think I sense there's some really valuable input in there.
Yeah, that was a great podcast. Fred was really open about the way that the whole industry has sort of taken his idea and sort of taken the notion of promoters and detractors and turned it into a survey mechanism and focused on the results of the survey and a score. I think Fred, we also talked about, AI and the use of AI and, Fred, interesting. He uses a lot of himself, but really does talk about a lot of things that we've talked about in the past about focusing on sort of driving the success of the business and understanding what promoters need and using it for that and for good. Yep. I think he also, his other key thought was the idea of earned growth versus bought growth. And that, I think that's the core of his new book, right? And the idea is that you can spend a lot of money and acquire customers, but earned growth are the customers who stay with you and bring on other people because of what's inherent in how you operate and interact with them. And I think that's where the connections is with the certainly customer experience and the promise, right? Which is that the only way you earn growth is by focusing on value props that resonate with certain audiences of customers and making sure that you deliver on those promises in an ongoing way. And that's the way you earn growth. And so the value of earned growth is way more value than purchase growth because those people have a higher lifetime value. Right? They stay with you more, they buy more. So the idea is that if I can acquire a customer, if I can bring on a customer and bring on customers, not all customers are equally valuable because the ones that I've earned that really like what I do, want to do more with me, are going to end up being much more valuable in the long run than customers who just come on because I hit them with an offer and they decided to buy something from me once.
Because there is more than the transactional value. There is more. There is also a personal connection or a really identification with the need or and so you're not, as soon as that transaction, I think actually the Bigger Meals is a good example. As soon as that goes, there's nothing else to keep you there. Like it's really like a transactional, if the price goes up or something like that, you might lose them because there's no other emotional connection or relationship beyond the transactional offer in that case. So that's I like that because that also really comes back to really understanding how you're addressing customer needs and making sure your loyalty is linked to that and not to the transactional elements of your offer, basically. How does that your time at Qualtrics? I mean, how much of that were you I know you were driving the XM Institute, but I'm sure you're familiar with some of the achievements that clients did with the platform. Like, what was it like at Qualtrics? Like, how was Qualtrics really trying to also empower organizations with the tooling to achieve some of the things we just discussed?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So Qualtrics, being the largest platform and the fastest growing platform, was dominating the industry, and so had a disproportionate impact on how people were thinking about customer experience, employee experience, and experience management in general.
Yep.
And so there were, you can imagine, throughout the world, there were clients. There are a bunch of people who are using it as a tool, right? I would say the overwhelming majority uses a tool, which can have some value in some cases. It's good to do research. It's good to find out stuff. But there were certainly when we started, a handful of companies that thought about experience management as a core to their strategy. And so what's interesting is when I started there were very few large deals, right? And large deals, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about numbers and dollar size, but large deals generally come from organizations where senior leaders decide they're going to use this platform as a way to restructure how they do go to market or work differently. And so over the years, what I felt was really, really good to see is that our work to educate the market on the power of not the tool, but the things you can do with the tool, got to the point where there were lots of large organizations, whether it's one large company was reorganizing their entire structure around journeys. Another one was putting in place entirely different employee incentive programs and employee sort of structures based on, and that type of work became increasingly what we saw with clients, as opposed to when we started, it was the questions around how should we format our survey? What type of measurement metric should we use? And should we use a 7-point scale or a 5-point scale? Those types of questions were what we initially had. After that, it was like I would be talking to, a CEO about how they can think about growing their business over the next 5 years.
Yeah. Now it's really about how you act on those insights, right? That really make departments also really customer obsessed, or really intrinsically driven to improve that value offering, and not only fix what is broken. Yeah? So I think really understanding and interpreting the insights instead of just ticking them off, I think is also what really helps build that kind of customer-centric capability in the organizations. And it's great if a tool can kind of facilitate that rather than just being the tool it is, I guess. So yeah, yep. we are also a Qualtrics, at a sense, a Qualtrics partner here in the Netherlands. And we see also some of the companies maybe initially starting with the goal to have a voice of the customer program or a feedback program to say, okay, how can we be more aware of the customer feedback and act on it? But then as they start using it, they actually see the additional potential it has to become more customer centric and facilitate this cross-functional discussion on improving the offer further, and not only, removing complaints that you might be getting, for example. So I think it takes a bit of time. It may be a good starting point, the voice of the customer feedback loop. But hopefully it also leads to inspire senior management to benefit more from it. Also in terms of customer centricity that it enables organizations. Okay, so thanks for that. I mean, very interesting. And now, of course, you're on to your next adventure. I think a year ago or so, you initiated or launched your Humanity at Scale initiative or company, or what I should call. Can you maybe share a bit about what is the mission and what drove you to initiate this, and what's really your motivation for doing this step?
Yeah, so I have to say I loved my time at Qualtrics. I had 5 great years, and I loved it up until the end. But for me, I felt like I was getting to the point where I was doing the same thing a lot over and over again. And I felt like I had internally a mission to do more. I wasn't sure what that mission was, but I knew I wanted to do more and have a bigger impact on the world, cool. Which is when I realized that, after a lot of whiteboard sessions, a lot of discussions with friends, and my wife, who I had, co-founded the CXPA. She was with me at CXPA, Temkin Group, and XM Institute. And we came up with this notion of humanity at scale, which met a lot of the things that were central to me. So first of all, humanity, I mentioned earlier, when I was at Temkin Group, one of the things we did to sort of understand our position in the world was to say, we're not about customer experience. That's just an output. But what we are an organization that is focused on understanding human beings and how they respond to the systems around them, whether they're customers, employees, partners, right? That was secondary to us understanding human beings and the dynamics. And so what I realized is that if I can take what I understand about how organizations operate, how leaders work, and I merge that with my deep understanding of, human beings, whether it's behavioral economics and neuroscience, and then drive leaders to break one false assumption. And the false assumption is that you have to either focus on humanity or you have to focus on your organization's success. I feel that is a false trade-off. And so realize that if I put all my skills together, and the at scale part is the way I've worked my whole career, right? I work on providing content and tools that help thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So it all came together that humanity at scale is my approach to help leaders lead in a new way in which they actually leave behind them a legacy of human-centric organizations. And so I'm going to teach leaders how to lead in a slightly different way, how to think about people as a primary opportunity for them to achieve their results, not as an either or to their results. And I believe that we can make a huge impact on the world, influencing one leader at a time.
Wonderful. That sounds like a great mission to have, Bruce. Is that then a combination of consulting on a company level in combination with sharing formats and learnings to the wider community, or how are you intending to combine those two?
Yeah, I'm not going to do a lot of consulting because that doesn't support my at scale approach, right? I hope that other people consult and have a consulting streams, but what I'll do is I'm going to push the education part of it, right? So I have a weekly newsletter. I have a Humanity at Scale Redefining Leadership podcast. Those will be the core things. Probably later in the year, I'll have, or early next year, I'll have training and certification on what it means to be a humanity-centric leader. I speak at events, right, where there are lots of leaders, so I get the message out. So I'm going to focus on a lot of things that are scale-oriented, as opposed to consulting things where I'm working with a single organization.
Wonderful. So with that, to the listeners here, I'm sure this inspires many of us to also incorporate some of those aspects. And it's not, like you said, it's not either or. So it's also human aspects are foundational almost in CX as well. So I think, how can some of the CX professionals or cross-functional people here in the audience leverage some of your output there? Is there a resource that they can look to, or your website, or what do you recommend how people can take some of the ingredients that you're providing into their daily work?
Yep. So I would say the number one thing is just to subscribe to my weekly newsletter. The reason I say that is that's the central way where I communicate what I'm doing. It's on Substack. It's humanityatscales.substack.com. So every week I share there's some core content. I'll give you an update on where my podcast, what my new episodes are.
Exactly.
And if you're looking for the podcast, they're like everywhere, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever.
I'm on the newsletter, and this is how I read about your podcast with Fred. So I recommend everyone to sign up. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. And I'm just, my company name, which I don't use very much, is Temkinsight. I'm going to be launching my website soon, but I don't really care about the company name. I care about humanity at scale. Mm-hmm. And I would also say, if your listeners sort of want to do something, I think the first step is the commitment to be a human-centric leader, right? Like, I think, you can read about it, you can hear me talk about it, you can go to the podcast and do all that. But I always say the first step is have to be intentional, right? Intentional about wanting to be a leader that leaves behind you a trail of positive humanity. So if I get your listeners to do one thing, make that step commitment. To be intentional.
Pledge. It's almost like
about
a pledge.
It's
like a human pledge. Can you give me just to make it practical for the audience? Is there one or two things that am I right in, maybe I'm imagining like, for example, more like learnings around what technology, for example, does to like human interactions or stuff like, is that like more generic findings or really commitment to like really being motivated of driving real value and not just commercial value? Like, what are the kind of things that you're intending to kind of really educate people on? Can you give one or two examples?
Yeah, so I think one of them is certainly sort of understanding how humans behave from a neuroscience and behavioral economics standpoint. And that's sort of a lot of jargon. But what I really want to do is if leaders can better understand how other people respond to their decisions and actions, they can make smarter decisions, right? Yeah. So I can, as a matter of fact, I just recorded a podcast today with a truly inspiring leader, Renee Cachillo, who's the CEO of Safelite. And so part of what people can learn like that is how you can actually engage and inspire an organization to do the things you want. She talks about vulnerability, how a leader can have vulnerability with their staff and get more out of them, right? Than if you actually tell them. And as a matter of fact, my newsletter today about the difference between compliance and commitment, those are the types of education that I want leaders to understand about people.
So it is as much an internal thing as an external thing, right? It's like, it is all really about how we collaborate together, but also how we treat customers, both, I guess.
How we think about people and our interactions with people, whether they're customers, employees, bosses, whoever. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sounds like a great thing to follow. On that note, Bruce, any new next guest suggestion that after we've been speaking about this and the Promise Podcast purpose, like who should I really be speaking to and inviting to this podcast after you?
So I did love Fred Reichheld. He was great. I would say I go back to like how we opened this. I think Ed Bastian, if you can get him, would be awesome. So Ed Bastian's the CEO of Delta. And the reason I say that is not because of what I told you about Delta originally. But I will say, the reason I think you'd be a great guest is I always do informal research wherever I am. I'm always asking people, like, and this is a typical thing, what's it like to work here? I ask that question almost all the time, but I fly a lot. So I'd asked that for years to different airlines that I'm on. There was starting 6 years ago, there was a noticeable change in how Delta employees responded to that question. And they started responding in a much more positive way than every other airline. So I think Ed Bastian's customer experience has a lot been driven by how he's changed the culture and attitude inside of Delta that has resulted in a lot of that. So he'd be my awesome guest for you to get on your show.
No, it sounds like a great example for other executives to follow that route of really spotting value perception in clients and making that a USP and to drive lasting loyalty in your customer base. That's fantastic. And you see actually many companies that are being loved have done that. Yeah, so I think it's definitely a road to success as well, as we know. All right. With that, Bruce, any final advice you want to leave the audience with today?
I would just say that at the end of the day, everything you achieve is because you're connected in some way to other people. And make sure that you keep understanding that your success is never done alone. It's always done because of the people around you. So appreciate them and find ways to share all of that success with them.
Colleagues, customers, they're all humans. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you, Bruce, and see you on LinkedIn. Thanks.
So, that was another episode of the Promise Podcast, where we discuss effective ways for brands to deliver on their promise with a great customer experience and business impact. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave a review. Check haroldlammers.com for more great content. Hope to see you again in the next episode. Until then, keep pushing to deliver on the promise.